Welcome to Lunch Hour Live. I'm Sue O'Connell. You know, you've heard the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but man, the photos that captured the unimaginable pain of 2020 just left me speechless on a regular basis. We had COVID-19, the pandemic, we had the protests for racial equity, and press photographers brought us into the center of 2020, a year that we can truly say was like no other. Now, for the first time, the Boston Press Photographers Association is showcasing the award-winning photos from their annual Pictures of the Year contest. This outdoor exhibit can now be seen in Justice Gordon Park outside Nubian Square. And joining me today are two of the folks who were instrumental in making this exhibit happen and were on the front lines capturing this year. Brian Snyder, senior staff photographer at Thomson Reuters and winner of Best in Show. Congratulations, Brian, and welcome.
Thank you.
And Meredith Nierman, who's GBH's director of photography. Meredith, good to see you. Welcome to Lunch Hour Live.
Thank you, Sue. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. I want to remind everyone watching us at home, please send us your comments and questions on Facebook and YouTube. We'll try to get to them throughout the show. We're going to take a look at some of the award-winning photos from this exhibit, but first I have to ask you a question. Press photographers take thousands of photos every year, especially now in digital, right? It's not like you have to run home and develop the film. You can just shoot away. And this exhibit features just a sliver of those photos. What is it about these photos featured in the exhibit that makes them the best? Brian, I'll start with you.
The pictures were all chosen by a panel of judges from, well-respected photographers in the industry. So it's their version of what they thought was the best. I would say another group might have picked a different set of pictures. But it also it's a good reminder that, these are sort of a selection that was picked by these judges, but there's so much great photography that is done every day that you just need to remember just how much great work is being done. And certainly in the last year, the risks that the photographers took to make those images.
Yeah, Meredith, I want to talk about that in a little bit in the show, the risks that and the bravery that folks on the front lines in many areas have shown. And I always hate to say these are the best, like these are the award-winning, but we have had so many incredible images this year from photographers from all over the world, haven't we?
Yeah, we have. And, I think I always try to remember that there are so many different ways that are great to capture a moment. But I think with these images, they each capture something really special and does so in a way that is evocative and, sort of makes you think a little bit more. I think, still photography is a frozen moment in time. It's a split second. We don't have the noise we have now, or people can't, they're seeing my hands move. You just have this frozen frame. And I think the best photos, even though they're frozen in time, they actually tell more story than you'd think, and often evoke emotion and raise questions. And I think many of the images do that in their own ways.
Let's take a look at some of the great photos. Obviously, a common theme for 2020 was pain, and that was written all over the face of this subject who was participating in a protest for racial equity last spring. Brian, you took this photo during the protest. Can you talk us about what was going on and how you took the photo? Like, how did you see what you were taking, and did you get what you thought you were getting?
So it was a protest that started in Franklin Park and had moved to a nearby T station. At that point, there was sort of a police line. So this is on the line between the police and the protesters, and there was a ledge so we could stand on to get a little bit of elevation to shoot over the police. I think the one thing I'd say about this picture is, I filed 30 pictures from that protest to the wire. And I think it's, this is important. I mean, there is anger, there's justifiable anger, but that isn't the only feature of the protest or the only feature of the movement. And so this picture is within that context. And I was very careful in the pictures that I filed to tell the story of that event that it wasn't all people screaming, but which takes nothing away from her totally justified anger in expressing that.
How do you choose? You know, when I'm having, you know, been at the protest, seeing photographs and video of so many exceptional moments, right? You know, both pain and joy and violence and anger. I can't even imagine how many photos you took that day. How does this one rise to the level of being what it is and being as compelling as it is?
I think when you're clicking along through your take, this, you know, something like this stands out. I think this was pretty, I think I knew when I shot it that, you know, that was a good moment. That was a moment. And that was a moment that said something that would probably be a part of my ultimate edit to tell the story of what happened that day.
Meredith, so many folks with the advent of digital cameras, and you know, one of my greatest visionary moments is when someone told me, "Hey, you're going to be able to take pictures with your phone," and I went, "Who would want to do that?" That gets quoted back to me in a lot of family parties. Clearly, everybody does, but the art of taking a great photograph still is something that you train for and get educated for, and your experience helps you to find that. And I'm wondering, when you go out in the field or when you're doing a photo shoot, what elements are you thinking about that helps you to get the image you want to convey the story that you want to tell?
Yeah, I actually think the first step is really observing and watching, because then the elements reveal themselves to you. You know, any situation you walk into, even if you're going back to a place you've been before, like, you know, it's a different story that day. And so I think it's just sort of looking around to see, I mean, in the case of a protest, sort of what's happening where. I think you're sensing a lot. You're sort of at a protest feeling tension. You know, in other cases, like when you go to somebody's home, you're thinking, you know, as you understand the story, you're thinking about what kind of environment should the person be placed in that would sort of help to tell the story. I mean, I'm always looking for feeling, and I think that's a very sensing thing. And then, you know, you sort of want the elements of the image to come together in a really good way to form a whole. And I know we're going to look at Jess Ronaldi's photo soon, but
Yeah.
I can say more to that because I actually think that photo does it very, very well.
Right, I was going to say, this is a photo that brings together all the elements that you're certainly talking about.
Yeah.
It's such a haunting photo. Jessica Ronaldi, a staff photographer for the Boston Globe and winner of Photographer of the Year. This shot taking, obviously, during the surge of COVID deaths last spring. Who's in this photo? What's the story? It's just such a compelling image.
Yeah, and connecting back to where, you know, you had us start, which is painful too. So that photo was taken, I believe, in April, sort of, you know, really when things were just so intense with the pandemic. It was also still winterish. It's taken at a funeral home, a family-run funeral home called the Ruggiero Funeral Home in East Boston. Jess was there. And what you're seeing is sort of what that family business was dealing with. I think they went from normally about 25 funerals per month to almost triple that in April. And all the normal things that they had put in place in the process of preparing people, families coming in, were just upended by the pandemic. So they were upended because they were so overwhelmed and they really didn't even have places for caskets. And, you know, they were upended because all of the normal things they would offer to families to help with grieving, like rooms to sit in, you know, to be with each other, and, you know, reception areas, those things were all gone. They didn't have space. They also had all these precautions in place. So I think the photo was really showing, you know, one of so many stories of how this pandemic just impacted people, in this case, a family business, and just dramatically changed how they had to go about things and overwhelmed them in many ways. And yet this family, you know, is really plowing through and trying to do good work.
I want to be careful how I ask this question, because I don't want to take away from the humanity and the pain and the real people that are in that photo and the real horror that they experience. But at the same time, what makes it, I think, compelling, and what makes it different from if I just went in and take a photo is part of the framing of it, that it's not just a full body shot of the coffin. It gives a humanity in a way that is more compelling. Can you talk about what photographers are thinking when they're taking photographs like that? Is how all the things are moving in their head that will help them to really communicate and connect the feeling of what's happening by framing it?
Yeah, well, I'll do that by like telling you a little bit about what I see just this photo. I think, you have key elements in many of the corners. You've got, I can't see the image right now, but I remember it well. Bottom left, you have, the casket and the I believe to be a woman's feet showing, and the right, you have another casket covered up. Those lines then draw the viewer into the central part of the story, which is this funeral home and sort of all that they're dealing with. You see another casket, you see top left, this sheet or plastic thing hanging for COVID precautions. And I think all of the elements come together to tell such a complex story. And, both from narrative, like how do you not start thinking about all these elements, but even just visually, it just works so well and draws you right into that center point of this funeral home, doing their best and being overwhelmed. I do want to say the way Just framed those feet is very intentional. I think for a few reasons. It's very important to ensure the privacy of the person featured, the person who's died. I think also for their family, both the privacy of the family and respect. So that's very intentional on her part. I also think you don't need to see the whole person. In fact, it's more powerful. You see sort of a hint of this person, but even that hint brings a whole person forward in some way.
Right. Brian, I don't think folks, they probably shouldn't, they don't understand how dangerous it was for journalists and photographers this past year. It's a category of employment which worldwide continues to be a dangerous place to work. People are always shocked when I tell them where we rank on the most dangerous businesses in the world. Many photographers and news people were given flak jackets, bulletproof vests, different protective gear as they went out to cover things that were happening this past year. How do you keep your focus to do your job and do your art when you're in a chaotic or emotionally charged environment or situation?
Well, Reuters has provided, we've had multiple recurring training for working in situations like that. So like it goes, you hear this in multiple arenas that, you can fall back on the training. Like we've learned how to work safe as we can in those situations. It's interesting going into this year or going into last year, we normally you would carry your gas mask sort of hanging on your belt so you could get to it quickly because, that can happen really quickly. And it was pointed out by the safety people that you didn't want to do that because if it's hanging on your belt and then you throw it on your face, now you've put a gas mask full of COVID potentially on your face that you're going to be breathing from an inch away for however amount of time. So we had to change how we carried our gas masks to protect them because of COVID precautions on top of worrying about tear gas and pepper spray and stuff.
And still take great photos, like the one we're going to look at right now, which is a couple standing on their porch, raising their fists in support as protesters are passing their home. Brian, you took this photo. There's some personal meaning to you behind this shot. Can you tell us about that?
So it's sort of serendipity. When I shot this, we were just, the protest was moving. We were walking. I saw it. I made the pictures and was sort of carried along by the protest. I didn't have time to stop and talk to the people on the step. Done. A year later, Reuters decided to go back and do a sort of, let's talk to some of the people from our most memorable pictures about what they think a year on about what has happened and where we are and where we've been. And they asked me if I could get in touch with this couple. At the same time, we were putting together this exhibit and we needed permits from the Boston Arts Council. And they, in one email, one of the council members sends me a message and says, Brian, one of the people in your pictures is on our board. So at that point, I suddenly could find these people. Otherwise, I would have had to walk up and down the street and try to match the picture and start ringing doorbells, and that may not have gone well. So total serendipity that I got to know Robert and Betty Freeman, and they're amazing people and had a great story to tell about, the work, the activism they had during the 60s and how it was brought to now and how moved they were to see that protest out. They had no idea the protest was coming. They heard the noise and they walked out, and that was their gesture in support of the protesters. So yeah, an amazing coincidence that's allowed me to get to know two really amazing people.
That's a great story. That's great. Meredith, we had this pandemic. We're having the protests for racial equity. And hey, we also had a historic presidential election that we put into the mix there, right? This is another photo from Jessica Ronaldi from the Boston Globe of Biden and Trump supporters outside the State House after Biden was announced the winner of the election. There's always some great photos that come from the Massachusetts State House whenever there's, protests, whether it was the marriage equality stuff that happened at the beginning of the century, because I just think there's so many great moments of visual cues to the State House. What about this photo? What does this photo in this moment, what does it embody and what does it communicate?
Yeah, well, you just set it up for me, because sort of who gets to stand on those steps in moments of protest is really symbolic. And there's a long history in Boston of, protests leading to the State House and people trying to sort of occupy the stairs. That was taken on November 7th, right after Biden was declared the winner of the election. I think it captures something really important. I think it sort of shows the division that we're facing. Like you said, you have Biden supporters on one side of the frame. I think a single or a couple Trump supporters on the other. There's yelling involved, which I think really reminds us of sort of all of the tension and anger and just deep division. I think that also you see the masks on one side of the image, and then the Biden supporters don't appear to be wearing masks, or at least the woman in the front, which, as we all know, masks went beyond a public health topic during the pandemic and became a very political issue. And I think this image, really kind of pulls that all together very seamlessly.
I'm struck by reliving 2020, a year that I think my parents and grandparents would say, let's just forget about that year and let's move forward with their great Irish American roots of not talking about stuff and moving forward. But, here we are, a much more, I hope, enlightened generation where we want to make sure we keep these events open and working and healing where we care and fixing. Is that part of the rationale behind Meredith showcasing these photos that, some of them are just so painful to look at even now?
Yeah, I mean, Brian?
That's my dog exhibiting the pain.
From this year. I mean, Brian often talks about the work we do as the historical document, visual document, and I really agree with that. I think we all feel strongly that these images are a small number of stories of what happened to people in the public this year, and it's really important to give those images back to people. And I think that really was the main goal of the exhibit, to make them available again, to bring them together in a way that, in some way does a little bit of a summary of the year. I think that really is the headline there, that this is a record. And for every image we have here, there are hundreds of other stories that, aren't going to be told at this level, but to bring together a group of images that could be somewhat representative of all of the important things that were happening, is really important. I'd also just really quickly add that, often stories are happening in isolation. Even before the pandemic, there's so much happening around us that we never know about. And the pandemic highlighted that even more. And so I think in many of these images, people can see things that could have been happening down the street or 40 miles away that they're not going to know about otherwise, or they're not going to know at an intimate level. So that's why we're doing this.
Brian, were there moments of joy for you as well in 2020? I know we're focusing on some of the more challenging, painful pieces, but do you have any highlights of joy that you remember?
Definitely. I mean, I think I said recently, I mean, that's sort of the definition of resilience is, finding something, or part of resilience, part of surviving involves finding some joy or some positive or pleasure. I was in Seattle just as COVID started, when I flew there last March. Back when we didn't even know how to fly or stay in a hotel or anything. But I went to a church that was still broadcasting services, and I went to a dance company that was doing then the idea of doing a dance performance via Zoom or FaceTime or whatever was, no one had thought about how you do that. But they were still determined to do these things that were positive and, brought people comfort and joy. And so, yeah, there was plenty of that.
Well, we have some photos of joy. We've got a photo from Erin Clark of the Globe of little girls at their dance competition in Boston last March. This was right before the entire world shut down. It's just so delightful to see them. And then we have this image from Steven Senney. Is that how you say his name?
Yep.
Of the Associated Press. Again, another incredibly moving photo, a father hugging his daughter upon arrival at Logan Airport after getting his green card reinstated. And this question is for both of you. What's it like to have the privilege of sort of being able to enter these intimate moments in people's lives and capture them for us to share with them both their joys and their burdens? Does it get to you in the moment when you're doing it? Does it get to you? Do you recognize it later when you see it? Or is it just integrated sort of into your everyday approach?
I'll start. Yeah, I think if you're not going to connect to it, and if you don't feel it, then you're probably not going to make a very good picture. That level of empathy and connection, you need it. Otherwise, the picture will not convey them. You won't have the emotional connection and impact to the viewers later. So you have to be connected to people when you see them, and it's been extraordinary. Despite a pandemic and despite political differences and despite racial differences, racial questions about racial equality and equity, the number of people that have welcomed me into their lives is extraordinary. And you owe it to them to connect to them if they're going to let you in.
Meredith, how about you?
Yeah, I completely agree. The best images come when a photographer is very present and himself in the moment and with the people they're with. And that can happen one-on-one when you're doing a portrait with somebody. It can happen when you're in the middle of a crowd of 1,000 people marching down the street. I think it's the most essential thing. And it is the word you used. It's a privilege. It really is. And, it definitely can take its toll. I think that's necessary because of, as Brian said, you sort of, you're a feeling person in your photography. But it is, the same thing that, you have to really work to take care of, and take care of yourself is the thing that makes it such incredible work to do.
I want to talk to you about, as we wrap up here, sort of the future of photography for photographers entering the business. We've been through, in the journalism world, such a upheaval of change when it comes to photographers. I know, many small papers not having on-staff photographers any longer. Yet, just looking at these pictures, we can see how important photography is to conveying and connecting us. Do you have any advice for people considering photography as a profession, or for folks just, entering the journalism world in that way?
Go ahead, Meredith.
Yeah, I'll start with a practical thing, then we can bounce back and forth. I mean, take lots of pictures. You have to practice is just taking pictures. And, if you're photographing a person, don't don't take 5, take triple that, or take 40, and learn from what you're doing. I often tell people, sort of take a photo, look at it, make adjustments, see what works, keep, photograph, look. I always say get feedback. I mean, really try to learn from others who have more experience. Find work that you really love and admire, and really study it, and try to see if you can even talk to the person about it if they're willing and around. I think that those are things that help people not only gain technical skills, but also find their own sort of voice or vision, for a lack of a better way to put it.
Brian?
Yeah, I think the landscape is, dissuasive. I mean, there aren't a lot of jobs. It's, the equipment's not cheap. But I do believe, I think the last year proved, I mean, people who were stuck in their homes, working from home, never going out, getting the groceries delivered, etc. I mean, photographers were telling them about what was happening down there, around the corner, not in some far off country, but literally around the corner, because they weren't getting out. And so I think if you truly believe in what you're doing and have something to say, there still is room for photographers. I think fewer will manage to find a way, but there still is room. I mean, way back when I was in college, I remember it was in a big lecture. I was at the museum school, a big photo history lecture, 100 of us in the room, maybe 75. And the teacher, the artist, looked around and said, 2 of you will make a living on photography. And it turns out he was 100% correct. I know who they are, me and Todd Heido. I know who the 2 of us are from that room. So it's not like, I mean, even then, those are pretty small odds. So I don't know how much it's actually changed in that regard. I mean, maybe the odds still are 2%.
That's good advice. I remember when I was in school, our communications teacher said if everyone died in the industry tomorrow, you probably still wouldn't get a job. So it's the passion that gets you through. The exhibit is this weekend through June 20th at Justice Gordon Park, outside Nubian Square in Roxbury. Meredith, what do you hope folks take away from the exhibit?
I think some of the things we said, a better sense of so many of the stories that were happening around the corner, or, 40 miles away. I hope they feel maybe greater compassion for some of those stories. And as Brian said, also remember that there was resilience and even some hope in all of it.
Brian, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think she said it so well. I hate to tag onto that or diminish it. I guess also remember that the photographers that made these, it was with risk. I mean, they risked bringing COVID home every day, risked themselves getting sick, risked bringing it home, for some greater good. So maybe see that as well in the pictures.
Well, I thank you for joining us and sharing your work with us, and sharing these great photos from your colleagues. I'll be walking a couple blocks down this weekend to take a look at the exhibit. Thank you so much, Meredith and Brian, for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks to our audience on Facebook and YouTube. I'm Sue O'Connell. I'll see you next time on Lunch Hour Live. Thanks for spending your lunch hour with us. See you next time.